So thank you everybody for joining us today. A quick overview of our agenda and some of the tips to optimize our experience today. We're going to start with a welcome from me and some framing. We're going to look at some key highlights from version 2.0 of our policy brief. Then there's going to be a cross-sector panel discussion. We're going to hear from our panel, a wide array of experts that we have joining us today on the call. There'll be time for some audience Q&A, and at the end, I'll give you some action steps and close it out. So a couple of things. Captions are enabled, and you can adjust them based on your preferences. Today's session is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants after the webinar. And we're going to use the Q&A feature to share your questions with the panel. The chat is great too, but sometimes the Q&A feature kind of helps us filter and make sure that we get to those questions um, in a more efficient way. So for those of you who just joined, again, I'm Aurora Dreger, the project director of EALA. We've been working on this. We started our work almost 2 years ago with New America on version 1 of this paper. And it's so wonderful in the world of education and that nonprofit work when you find a partner that you love working with, and there's really like kind of seamless synergy there. So it was our honor and our pleasure to be able to partner again with New America for version 2. So to dive into some framing around the event and around why this paper is so important, I turn it over to my co-conspirator, May from New America.
Great. Thank you, Aurora, for that introduction, and excited to be able to talk more about our version 2. And just to give you a sense of how this all started is that I think Aaron and I started talking back in May of 2023 and said, let's try and get ahead of what we think is coming around AI policy, and trying to be more proactive about the kinds of policies that are needed, especially for learners of disabilities. And it was really about prioritizing those students, which ultimately better serves all learners regardless. And in 2023, we brought together a group of researchers, educators, families and students, and policymakers, industry leaders, and district leaders too as well, to really sort of get on the same page and think about what are the kind of AI policies that are needed going forward. And when I think about being prepared for this and thinking that, 2 years later, things have happened so quickly. So is the reason we thought we should do a version 2 of this, and to further prep for this and be ready, and thinking about things such as the Senate Bill 2750, which was introduced by Senator Cruz, that would create a federal sandbox of sorts for AI companies to test and develop AI technologies, sort of under flexible rules while the government is figuring out how best to regulate, period. And this type of AI policy brief, we think, is going to be important in helping think about what is needed to ensure that all learners are really being addressed, but also like just being proactive. And so this is our goal of being proactive and being prepared, and where accessibility is really treated as a priority rather than as an afterthought, and that learners are really at the center of design and development. And I think we have panelists on today that are going to be really perfect to be able to address that. But I'm going to turn it over to Erin, because she's actually going to go through the details of the updates on the policies and why this is important and what we need to do. So thank you, Erin.
Thank you so much. I want to join Aurora in just recognizing and acknowledging our collaborators at New America. It is so rare to uh, in our space, to collaborate on something, continue to iterate over a course of 3 years, and to have folks who are really thinking through and thinking about what's coming and what's around the corner. And I'm so excited today for us to share version 2 of this paper that was really meant to update our earlier paper and to keep pace or try to keep pace with the types of developments May was talking about. And so we're really in this place where we're trying to take this critical shift and really move beyond compliance and shift from what we would consider reactive compliance into really this idea that accessibility is really needed at the beginning of the work, at the beginning of design, at the beginning of development. I often talk about this analogy of if we are going to serve all students, we need to shovel the ramp in a snowstorm, not just shovel the stairs, because all students can get up the ramp while only some students can get up the stairs. And so this idea that accessibility and universal design for learning are embedded in the design and development of our tools as foundational layers is really critical. And so if you look at the version 2 of the paper, it's up there on your screen. Go ahead and snap that QR code, go to our website. You'll see that this paper really advances a core framework from one of our other alliances, the EdSafe AI Alliance. And what we recognized is that the work that EdSafe AI has done in adoption of the SAFE framework across 90 plus governments across the world, but also its widespread adoption in US districts and US states through our EdSafe AI policy labs could serve as a foundation as our movement really gets into this idea that safety and accountability, fairness and efficacy are table stakes for the work that we need to be doing in all AI and education work. But in particular, we very much focus on how to use the SAFE framework as an anchor to evolve the policy recommendations and to come up with a frame that really talks about foundational layers and pillars. And that's where I call this the meat and potatoes. So the evolution in V2 or the cliff notes for the paper are really that from V1 to V2, we are articulating 4 foundations or the non-negotiables to ensure that AI use isn't merely a technical update or a tooling update, but really an opportunity to close historical opportunity gaps and access gaps. And that starts with something that we modeled in the writing of this paper and that many of the panelists who you're going to hear from model every single day, which is how to meaningfully engage all stakeholders. How do you shift from consultation or just saying what's going to happen to authentic power sharing, whether that's in scoping and developing policies, that's in AI literacy training, which is our second foundation, or whether that is work that you're doing to engage parents, students, and educators in the capacity to be critical consumers of these tools. How are you embedding learning science foundations in the work? So how do we ensure that AI doesn't just serve productivity or task replacement goals, but pedagogical goals related to instructional and student outcomes rather than sort of seeking just student use? And then finally, how are we thinking about an iterative and responsive approach to governance as the technology changes and evolves in the field? Okay. And when you have those foundations in place, you can now move to really the 4 pillars for actionable guidance. So critical with our students with disabilities, and frankly, all students and all humans, is that we're upholding civil rights. That really ties to the SAFE pillar of fairness, that we're ensuring data privacy and student protection and understanding the heightened need for data privacy and student protection, particularly with intersectional health data for students with disabilities and identity data. Embedding accessibility by design, this idea that it's not an afterthought, it's the core of the work. And then how are we continually monitoring our systems so that they have transparency and accountability across those foundational layers? So think of this as sort of, this is the foundation, and then we're going to work through these actions to really bring this to life when it comes to AI technology development and deployment in our schools, in our communities, and in our districts. And so the TLDR, as my kids say, is that, what we have learned from V1 to V2 is that if we are putting students with disabilities at the center of the design development, deployment, and implementation, we solve first for the most complex needs within our student population, we can actually expand access and opportunity for all. That, when we do that, it's easier to identify different types of gaps that might exist in that foundational communication, privacy, and security, but also in really thinking about the use cases where there is a higher risk aperture and what's the policy that needs to respond to that. And then our hope is that by centering students with disabilities and all learners, that we're creating better tools, not just for students who have learning differences, but really for all young people. And so with that, I get to pass it over to Aurora to talk to a group of amazing folks, some of whom have been super active in the drafting of this brief, to really talk about where the rubber hits the road. How do you actually do this? What should we be thinking about? And how do we move this from meat and potatoes to dinner on the plate? Aurora.
I love that, Erin. That's fantastic. Great metaphor. Thank you so much, Erin. Our first question is, and I have the questions written here on the screen, so in case you are listening back, I'll read them out loud. Um, this brief emphasizes moving from reactive compliance to proactive design, just like Erin and Ame were just talking about. So, for the first panelist that I'm going to turn to, in your sector, what's the single biggest hurdle in making that shift right now? And so I'm going to pass this question to Yuta. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, Yuta, telling us your full name and the company, the organization that you represent, and let us know what's the single biggest hurdle right now.
Okay, great. Yes, my name is Jutta Tobranus. I'm the director of something called the Inclusive Design Research Center, which I founded back in 1993. So we've been working in this particular area for many decades. Um, and I'm also a professor in inclusive design at OCAD. So my perspective comes from a Canadian perspective, but I've also been working quite a bit globally with school systems around the world. And the largest hurdle that I'm finding is actually not, well, there are, it's the systemic issues that there are so many things that are actually designed in a way that they deprioritize students and individuals, teachers, staff with disabilities. And the way that we're trying to address this is through standardization. If you look at the current protections that exist, and of course, speaking regarding the US, there aren't that many protections, but there are other countries like the EU that have the EU AI Act, and within Canada, we are developing a standard called the Accessible and Equitable AI Standard, which is now a standard and which will become regulation. And the reason why we want to address the issues within the education sector globally with standards is to have collective support for the development of AI systems and the implementation of AI systems within education that would not exclude people with disabilities. AI in and of itself is designed in such a way that that people with disabilities feel the extreme harms of AI. The phenomenon that causes this existed before AI. It started when we began by using statistics to make general decisions about a population. And the one characteristic to know about disability is that if you have a disability, you tend to be at the extreme ends of, or the extreme edges of a data distribution. And so many of the population determinations that are made using statistics are either inaccurate or wrong for you if you have a disability. And AI automates and amplifies that issue. So, what we've been doing is to try to create standards that would add on to the existing protections and policies that exist. Um, the most of the protections or the ethics requirements, the benchmarks, the ethical certification uh, insists that the difficulty with respect to students with disabilities is that is a data problem, that we need to feed additional data to the AI systems such that they address the particular needs or the very diverse and different needs of students with disabilities. But even if there were to be full proportional representation in data, even if that were possible, even if we were able to remove the stigmatized information that the foundational models have been fed to produce the proxies and the labels, um, the system will still rule with the average and present the average. So the biggest issue that we're currently finding is that AI is homogenizing. It is, and when we've talked about it or systemically, it is similar to what we've called digital eugenics, in that it removes the difference that the personality, the quirkiness, and it rules against individuals that are different from the average. It is tuned towards the popular. And one of the things that we're seeing in the classroom is that students are experiencing what we've called cognitive surrender. It's easier to choose the average answer, the average suggestion that the system offers, and to thereby abandon your own differentiation, your own personality, your own quirkiness. Um, there and associated with that sort of statistical automated statistics are quite a number of issues. Of course, the students with disabilities are also frequently used as poster children to sell AI because there are extreme benefits to AI. And that then also puts those students in harm's way because of the privacy breaches that you've mentioned, the surveillance and manipulation that can occur with AI, the inverse benefits that happen with AI, whereby the AI works the best for students that are more like the average and works the worst for students that would require support the most, which leads to the assumption that the problem has been solved and therefore no further accommodation is required. And of course, one of the other things that tends to happen is the students that are most vulnerable to the privacy breaches and data abuse are also the students that are subjected to the significant stereotypes that come with the foundational models and the large language model responses. But there's more. That,
Oh, yeah, I know. There's so much to this. It's a really, really meaty issue. Two of the phrases that you just threw out there, digital eugenics and cognitive surrender, that just blew my mind. I've never heard those phrases, and it's so spot on. It's such a great description. Thank you for that. Um, Ariana, I'm going to call on you next to give us a little bit of a perspective, especially from the research lens. So, introduce yourself, your name, tell us about a little bit about your work at CDT, which was highlighted heavily in this brief, and then yeah, tell us more about what, from your perspective in your sector, what's the biggest hurdle right now?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Ariana Abulafia. I'm an attorney and I lead the Disability Rights and Tech Policy Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. CDT is a tech policy organization based in Washington, D.C. in the United States. And we think about tech policy through the lens of civil rights and civil liberties. My work specifically focuses on the rights of people with disabilities, and in this context, students with disabilities a lot of the time. Um, my work is sort of a mix of research, law, and policy. And so, I think the first thing I would start off saying is like just sort of some of the concerns, I think the barriers and hurdles that are in the policy environment in the United States specifically. And so, One of them is that, insofar as we're talking about AI policy or AI regulation, um, we aren't necessarily starting at what I call step zero, which is thinking about what is AI and what is it that we are regulating and how is it that we are defining AI. Something that I say a lot is if you worked in transportation policy, it would be unusual to get a bill in front of you that's about transportation and to not know if you're talking about the regulation of planes, trains, or automobiles. But in the context of tech policy, we're having these conversations about the regulation of AI and what it should look like. And we haven't agreed whether we're talking about machine learning or large language models or deep fakes or algorithmic systems that are used in hiring tools or all of those things or none of those things. And so we aren't kind of having that defining conversation before we are getting to the step of regulation. Another thing I would say that is happening sort of again that's impacting the policy environment is federal AI legislation in the United States, especially sort of like a broad spanning rights impacting AI bill has been stalled for quite some time. And you see, there are statutes that impact things like deepfakes. The Take It Down Act was passed last year. But what we've seen instead is that a lot of state legislators are sort of rising to the moment to pass bills that they believe, or that they are at least attempting to mitigate harms of some of these technologies for their constituents. And so we have this sort of push and pull of states sort of attempting to rise to that moment. And we have a continued fight that started about a year ago that sort of continues to be this sort of zombie concern that keeps rising again on preemption, where the federal government is trying to preempt states from passing bills on AI, which is a problem for all sorts of reasons. And then even sort of to take even a further step back, and this is sort of the basis not only of my policy work, but also of a lot of my research, is that law in the United States in particular kind of moves a bit slowly. There's a lot of emphasis on procedure, and to a certain extent, emphasis on bipartisanship, and those are not bad things. But tech inherently moves very quickly, right? The move fast, break things ethos of tech and of tech developers is somehow a little bit incompatible with the structure of American law in a lot of ways, meaning that by the time that statutes are passed, a lot of times these technologies may have already changed, or they might have already impacted lots and lots of people. Um, and so I was talking to students a couple of weeks ago, and a student brought this exact thing up to me that, his perspective was, how do you exist in this space with these incompatibilities? And my response was, welcome to the Wild West, right? And that's a bit of an overstatement, but the answer to that is as to how we exist. There's twofold. One is that there are things that we can do now. There are existing statutes that, specifically in the context of disability and disability rights, that are in my opinion, are sufficiently broad enough to help mitigate harms to certain populations. And so, a research report that I wrote last year on generative AI and the use of generative AI to build out IEPs and the ways in which that could interact with statutes like FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And I believe that those statutes do, in fact, interact with AI generated outputs, right? So we can think about the laws that already exist. We can think about research, right? Doing legal research, doing qualitative and quantitative research, and making sure we have a body to fully understand how this is impacting folks. Then the other thing that we can do is we can provide recommendations, and the brief on centering disabled students in AI policy that we're talking about today does a good job of this. We can think about sort of how to advise developers and how to advise users of these technologies to design better more inclusively in advance, right? And that's not to say that the expectation is that a developer or a designer or a deployer be able to forecast every single issue that may occur. However, some harms are more foreseeable than others. And if we think about that paradigm shift, right, not of thinking of, okay, we're going to build a technology, we're going to move fast, we're going to break things, we're going to get it to market because we don't have to comply with all that much right now. Um, at the end of the day, you may in fact have to comply with things. So it's probably better to just make it inclusively, make it better, make it accessible in advance, right? And to a certain extent, one of the metaphors that I use, at least in my mind, when thinking about a lot of these things, um, is it better to build an accessible website or to later have to deal with an accessibility overlay, right? Folks in the disability community from day one have said, and I agree, right, that like we don't want to deal with an accessibility overlay company. They're not that good. They're not that helpful. It's much better to design it inclusively from the beginning, right? And that I think is the inflection point that we are at with AI. And I do in fact see that point in the chat about Title II, and I plan on talking about that too, and I'm sure some of my colleagues will as well. I'll turn it back to you, Aurora.
Thank you, Ariana. I mean, and right off the gate, your metaphor of when we're talking about tech policy versus when we're talking about, say, transportation policy. We don't know if we're talking about planes, trains, or automobiles, right? If we're not able to define accurately what we mean by AI, then we've got an issue from the jump. So I appreciate that. I love these panels. I get a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different little nuggets of wisdom. So for our next question, broad policy frameworks are essential, but the last mile is the classroom, right? What does this look like in action? So my question is going to start with Lakeisha. How do we ensure these policy recommendations don't just sit on a shelf, but actually change the procurement and implementation process? And Lakeisha, you're doing fantastic work in Nashville. It was a pleasure to work with you in person back in December. So take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us about your work.
Yeah, hi everyone. Look, Lakeisha Brunson Thomas from Metro Nashville Public Schools. We have approximately 160 schools in our district with over 80,000 students. So this whole topic of procurement is really important to us and making sure that we get the right tools in the hands of our students. So I'm just gonna kind of walk you through our process in MNPS. So, one of the things that jumps out for us is really thinking about from the onset, how do we make sure that during the purchasing process that accessibility takes the lead? We do that in lots of different ways. The first one is thinking through like we have a very strategic, rigorous vetting process. That looks like myself, one of my colleagues who is over software. Then we have a purchasing lead for every software that comes through our district, every software request that comes through by our teachers, administrators, first the company has to be vetted. They have to make sure that they're complying with PII information. That's from the onset. But when it gets into teaching and learning, myself and whoever the subject matter lead is really has to evaluate that tool or resource. Why that matters when we think about AI and our students with exceptional needs is that any tool that comes through, I work directly with our exceptional education department, and they also vet any resources that we have that are going to get into the hands of teachers. Another thing that we pride ourselves on is any global tool that we purchase, meaning anything that our district pays for all students, it has to meet those requirements, but also we make sure that we, for lack of a better word, pilot set programs with our exceptional ed students and with our exceptional education teachers. We also make sure that we bring in our tech teams as well to really vet those, to make sure that those resources and tools work on devices that our students with exceptional eds have that some of our other students don't. Maybe 2 to 3 years ago, that's where we missed the mark when we thought about certain tools we were buying. We know that our students with exceptional needs may get additional devices. And at the beginning, we honestly were not testing those devices to make sure that the software met that requirement. And then lastly, one of the things we really pride ourselves on is when companies, vendor partners come in from the onset in our RFP process, we have our own section about inclusivity and making sure that the apps or the resources or the tools that they really talk about different ways that they're meeting state, district, local accessibility laws. We're going to keep moving. So, another thing that we do is when we think about, and you hear this all the time, I'm sure, we say it as well, all means all, right? All means all. Our superintendent has a saying that says every student known. And we take that to heart. And when we think about every student known, we want to make sure that we have consistency across all our platforms. What does that mean? Any district, again, approved resource, I'm going to take Schoology because that's what we use the most. We talk to our curriculum leaders, our exceptional ed department, and they have to agree to go into contract with said company. And that's they make sure that it has text to read features, that the software. One of the things that we just launched is something called Power Buddy, so that goes with Schoology. And one of the things that we noticed in that app or resource is that teachers were able to copy and paste text, which makes it more accessible to all of our students. So that was one of the biggest reasons we're using Power Buddy as our AI tool, is because our exceptional ed department said, hey, this is a win. Actually, our exceptional ed and our EL department. Another thing that we really think through in our district is making sure that every tool that we purchase, the district purchases, that it has the least amount of friction for all students. I want to be completely frank in saying in our district right now, teachers are able to use any AI system that they choose in the classroom. For our students, it's only three that are that's been vetted and are allowed in our system. With those three systems, our exceptional education department was a part of that work. And I'm going to close out with this statement. One of the things we really think about at MMPS is really thinking through integration and not isolation. So that looks like making sure in professional development, whenever we're thinking about any sort of professional development, not just AI, that every session has resources and tips, and then ways that we can meet the needs of our EE students and our EL students. We also really talk to our teachers about this whole concept of instructional design. So what does that look like, especially now as we're transitioning into AI tools and AI usage? And then lastly, we really make sure that the procurement process is followed to a T. That looks like every software that comes through has to go through a digital software approval process. And as I said before, there's three of us who vet those, and we always include an instructional member from our exceptional education department. So I'm going to pass it over
Thank
now.
you. Yeah, it's great to get the walkthrough and the level of detail that you're taking when you're considering. I love this phrase of every student known. I love that. I love that idea. Um, Now, Yuta, I know that you had some. I wanted to turn it to you to Perhaps there's some insights around, I think that we talked about AI and an assessment. If you have any comments, Yuta or Ariana,
Yeah.
around, yeah, how are these policies showing up? How can we actually implement them?
Yeah, so of course, there's a push toward implementing AI for almost all school functions at the moment. And one of a very active conversation is the idea that AI could be used not just to write the assessments, but also to mark the assessments, both even essays and not the usual single answer or easily marked systems or automatically marked systems. And that is quite concerning for a number of reasons. But one of the things that I'm even more concerned about is the pernicious uh, systemic impact of using AI for school accountability, which is also on the table in quite a number of states. So this would mean that AI would be used to set the targets and to monitor the progress schools have in a variety of different areas, or including numeracy, literacy, etc., the usual indicators that schools are judged by. And the reason why I'm quite concerned about this is that it will use largely or almost completely numeric metrics. And similarly to the issue of statistical discrimination, what will happen there is that the schools will be pushed to, and this has happened in other scenarios where these types of numeric metrics are required, to abandon the students that need more help. So, in order to have greater or to reach the threshold required for school accountability, district accountability in terms of performance of the schools, especially as schools are threatened with defunding or they're threatened with a variety of other things, um, to improve the metrics, they will either ignore or in some way reduce the attention that's given to the students that are underperforming or underserved. And that will be very detrimental to students with disabilities. And it actually leads to greater disparity. If they, um, as we move to AI, there is a tendency to not have the opportunity, or there won't be the human in the loop to say, wait a sec, these particular students should not be decided using AI. The measures should not use these metrics, the quantitative metrics that we have. So both in assessment of students, but also in the assessment of the schools, the teachers, the classrooms, the school districts. There is a risk here. And once it's automated, we're not going to be able to pull it back. There is this skill atrophy that happens. So if the AI replaces the human labor, it's highly unlikely that we'll have the opportunity for the human to step back in.
I think that's a fantastic point that you made about disparity. We already know that our students with disabilities are um, performing at lower levels than their peers without disabilities or without identified disabilities. So here we are at this moment where we can either, you know, proactively work to bridge that gap, or are we going to stand by and let the gap become even wider and to allow that atrophy to sink in? I think that's a fantastic way to phrase it. It's a not a uplifting thought, of course, but the way that you're framing it and thinking about it really does sort of pull up a call to arms, a call to action. So thank you,
Yeah,
Yuta.
and of course it's detrimental to this too. I mean, it puts us in, I mean, systemically and from a future imagination, like what is happening with a society where AI is present? We're doing exactly the opposite of what we need to prepare our students for that future. We're creating, or we're creating standardized students that
Mm,
are largely homogenous. We're creating a monoculture. We're teaching and emphasizing the formulaic. And that's not what we need when AI is going to be able to address, I mean, is far better at doing the formulaic. So we should actually be going in the opposite direction. But unfortunately, with AI, we're pushing our education system and our assessment systems towards creating greater monocultures, a greater push towards standardized learners rather than learners that can optimize their difference.
yeah, thank you. So for our third question, I want to look at this through three different lenses, and I actually want to start locally and then build out. So I'm gonna start this with Lakeisha. What must occur at the local level to ensure these recommendations are fully adopted? In particular, thinking about the core responsibilities, policymakers, developers, designers. What do you think we need to see at the local level? And then I'll go to Ariana and Yuta for national and global. But give us your local perspective or what's happening in your community.
Yeah, we hear this phrase of begin with the end in mind, and it sounds great and it sounds easy to do. But a lot of times we don't follow through with what that means. So a simple in words, maybe not action, is really to bring in expertise at the beginning. When developers are designing, they should be reaching out to our accessibility experts. They should be working with a diverse group of educators, of students, of those in technical fields. In my personal work history with vendors and vendor partners, the first step tends to be the technical pieces, like how does this technically work, instead of thinking about usability for our students. So I think if we start there and really have the conversations up front, do the focus groups, do a demo, have the students be in the platform, then we're all the better for it.
Thank you for that. And Ariana, do you want to give us pulling out a little bit more from a national level? What are some of the core responsibilities? What should we be focusing on here?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that, and this sort of goes off of what I mentioned before, but I'll dive in a little bit more, especially to this question about Title II, right? So I think in general, one of the like responsibilities and also just like best practices for policymakers and developers and designers is to really like embrace a growth mindset around AI and accessibility and how they interact with each other. To go into both on the development side, the development of technologies, and on the policy side, the creation of policy, with the understanding that compliance models will change. But like overall, to think about again the development of tech and also the development of tech policy, first of all, it's two things that are different but inexorably intertwined. But then secondarily, to think about those things from a perspective that's a real paradigm shift, right? That is not about compliance with what exists right now. That is not about doing it legally, but that's about doing it not just legally, but doing it right, right? That it is important that these things are having impacts on people. And to have the understanding that yes, the tech may move faster than the law, and yes, the law can change, and compliance standards can go back and forth and back and forth. But again, some of the harms, they are foreseeable and there are ways to mitigate them. And you have people like my colleagues at CDT and like, folks at the Educating All Learners Alliance and Innovate EDU and New America that are, creating these roadmaps to say, right, here are the better ways forward. Um, because we do in fact know how to mitigate some of those harms, but it all goes back to what is really like a psychological and sociological first, and then later regulatory paradigm shift that is not about legal compliance, right? And a lot of my work, I talk about accessibility being the floor. And what I mean by that is that whether or not a person with a disability can use a technology should not be the be all end all of where we begin and end in thinking about how tech impacts people with disabilities, right? Um, and outside the context of disability, whether or not someone is able to use a thing is not necessarily seen as, some great, wonderful thing. But so much of the intersection between disability and tech is solely about digital accessibility. And digital accessibility matters, right? And it's not to say that we should not still have those conversations and make tools accessible to folks with disabilities. But what we are seeing in this rapidly changing and evolving AI ecosystem is tools that are impacting and discriminating against disabled people in education, in employment, in healthcare, in benefits determinations. And we are not necessarily thinking about that through the lens of more than access and thinking about practice, right? And so I'll use Title II a little bit as an example, right, of like how these compliance things go back and forth, right? For those, and I'll be short because it's what a saga. But there was a rule for Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act for web and mobile compliance with WCAG standards. Um, and that was supposed to take effect about 2 weeks ago. And the Department of Justice put out an IFR, an interim final rule, basically pushing back the deadline a whole other year, but also hinted that there may be further rulemaking that changes the substance of the rule, right? And so that's kind of one thing that I mean when I say that like compliance can go back and forth. As of right now, we have a rule that's going to take place in 20 that's going to take effect in 2027. And so that is, still a thing as of right now, but things can change. What isn't changing though is that these technologies are having disparate outsized impacts on marginalized people, on people with disabilities, on multiply marginalized people with disabilities, disabled people of color, disabled queer and trans people. And so what we need to do as policymakers, as developers, is again like do the best that we can to future proof these things and to do it right because it's too important not to.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, Yuta, give us a sense of from a global perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say here. I think if I mean, given the limited time, I think one of the a critical thing is this notion of nothing without us. There, within the Canadian perspective, we've changed it to nothing without us about us, but we've shortened it to nothing without us for a variety of reasons. So meaning that we shouldn't be developing any of these things without the participation of the people that feel the greatest impact. And there's both a harm reduction component to that, but there's also a beneficial piece to it in that that's where the innovation will occur. That's how we can address the really critical problems and challenges that are inherent in AI and in any disruptive systems that are emerging. But the other thing I want to say from a global perspective is that this unfortunate sort of geopolitical competition that is currently happening is affecting education as well. And there's a tendency to be far more insular rather than global. And I think that's terrible, especially for marginalized communities and individuals. So I think at this point in history, we need to push back against that and collaborate across regions and reach out to other countries, communities, etc., that are also working on this. Because it's a massive problem that is a global problem. So actually collaborating and sharing globally is really critical.
Thank you. So for our last question, and in the interest of time, I'm going to call all of our panelists back in for this one, including Erin, Moat, and An May. Let's see if we can keep this a rapid fire. Let's see if we can get a 60-second answer to this one. if there is one specific policy change or action that policymakers should prioritize this year, um, what would it be? And may I pass it to Erin Moat first? I saw you come off first. I'm going to see if you got, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll start. I really appreciate the comments of the panelists. You guys did such an incredible job, and I want to pick up on a thread here and introduce a word or two words into this space, which is around consequential decision making. Ariana talked a lot about, and so did well, actually, every panelist talked about the need for these systems not to make decisions for us, and for it not just to be a human on the loop who's validating the decision, but a human in the loop. And so I would want policymakers to be paying attention to consequential decision making for students in education and ensuring that it's not the data that's making the decision about what school, community, financial aid young people have access to, but instead we make sure that the consequential decision making that might be part of these systems is overseen by a human in the loop. And so that would be my specific policy that I would want folks to be really focused on. And I appreciate the work that's going on actually in Florida right now around thinking about students with disabilities and consequential decision making.
Thank you, Erin. Let's go to Lakeisha. Then I'll do Ariana and Yuta in our order, and then Anme, you can round us out. So
Yeah,
Lakeisha. Mhm.
I'm gonna stick with bringing in all the stakeholders that are needed. Start from the beginning, making sure they have alignment with data privacy, with accessibility, with making sure the tool or resource is instructionally aligned. That will do good for all students.
Thank you.
Sorry, am I next?
Sure, go ahead. Yuta, then we'll go to Ariana. Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
No,
Um,
great. Thank you.
so yeah, again, a hard choice. But I think one of the things is just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. And I think there's an opportunity to recalibrate education rather than doing what we've always done more efficiently, accurately, effectively, and automating it using AI, which seems to be the push within the sector at the moment. It's a time to reconsider, is this actually a practice that we want to turn over to AI such that it becomes part of the infrastructure and becomes mechanized? Or should we reconsider this to better prepare the students for a world with AI within it?
Yeah, thank you. And Ariana?
Yeah, I will say two quick things, which is number one, policymakers should center and talk to affected communities, make the effort. Something I say a lot is that people who say that they want co-designers often actually just want co-signers. And
Mm,
what I mean by that is that you can't just pick and choose one person with one type of disability to who you already know agrees with you and is already going to tell you that everything you're doing is perfect and you're precious. That's not real community engagement. And so, and thinking about co-design, not co-sign, as something that applies not just to tech development, but to tech policy, because both of those are levers that impact us every day.
thank you. Thank you. Ahmed?
And I will just agree with what everyone has said, and really plus one to what Erin's saying. All your remarks were just spot on. The one thing that I will add to it is a very practical one, and that we ensure that AI literacy and digital literacy are foundational skills, and so that we put the responsibility, but also the power back with the students and educators should learn how to use AI responsibly and be able to understand the outputs and think critically alongside like what should or should not be happening along all these systems reform that's happening. So especially the students, because they are our next generation of leaders, and the better we prepare them, the better off we'll all be.
Thank you. Folks, it looks like we've answered your questions. If there are any follow-ups, I'm going to share my email in a moment. So if there's anything else you want to ask the panel, you can email me, and I'll try to get your answer passed along. So we're almost at our time here. So take action. So you've listened to this panel of experts. You're riled up. You've got all these great ideas. Now, what should you do? Read the brief. Explore version 2.0, prioritizing students with disabilities and AI policy. I believe we'll be able to drop a link in the chat in a moment. I might not be able to, some screen sharing. But we will make sure that all of the recipients, all the registrants of this webinar have all of the links. Amplify the resource. We created a toolkit to help you share with your professional networks and school communities. So that's pre-written language and graphics to help make it even easier for you to share the mission, share the resource. Finally, as I was saying, stay connected. Reach out if you want to discuss implementation, partnership opportunities, or have more questions answered. I put my email right there, and I'll drop it in the chat as well. Aurora@innovateedunyc.org. And there is one more opportunity to engage or to dive deeper into this work. On May 18th, Erin and I will be joining on May, as well as several folks from New America and CAST for Wired for Equity, Bridging the Disability Gap in Classrooms. It's going to be a great kind of continuation and a deeper dive into this conversation. So I encourage you to register. We've got the link there. If we're able to drop it in the chat, perhaps my tech support can drop that in the chat. And if not, I'll make sure that it's in the follow-up email. It's a virtual session, May 18th. And we hope you can see it. And it's free to register, of course. Thank you everybody for joining us today. I see some positivity in the chat. And with that, I will let you all go. It's Friday afternoon, at least on the East Coast, it's 5 p.m. So thank you for spending the last few hours of your workday with us. Thank you so much for dropping for the information in the chat. Thank you, Anmei. Thank you, Erin, Lakeisha, Yuta, and Ariana for helping us uplift and support this conversation and in your contributions to the brief. It was great to be here, everybody. Thank you so much, and have a great day.